Hi class, welcome to lesson 3 where we will be, lesson 8. I keep confusing myself because this is part 2. So lesson 8 we're going to be talking about complex selectors. So up to this point we've been using what we call global selectors or class or ID selectors. We're going to talk about some different selectors that you can use in your CSS code to select specific items in the HTML. So the type selector will identify an element based on its type. In other words, how this element is declared within the HTML. So this is what we call a global selector because it's already defined by HTML code. A class selector we've talked about a few times. This is one that you create and you give it a specific name, and it identifies an element based off its given class attribute value, and you assign that attribute value. The class can be reused on multiple elements as needed to help share styles. So if you want several things on your page to be lime green, you can create a class that it just makes things lime green, and you can apply that class to those elements. An ID selector will only be used once on a page, and it's unique. So the ID selector identifies an element based on its given ID attribute value. The ID differs from the class selector as they must be unique and only should be used once per page. So for example, they used an ID called intro on this particular page and they only used it once. So a child selector is a way to select elements that fall within other elements or are nested in other elements, making them children within their parent element. So two common ways to select child elements are with a descendant selector and with a direct child selector. The most common way is with a descendant selector. So let's talk about that for a second. The descendant selector will match every element that follows an identified parent element. So it does not have to be directly after the parent element. So for example, you have section is your parent element in this code. There's a paragraph directly after that parent identifier, but then there's also another paragraph within this div that is also within the section. So if you type section P as your selector, it's going to select all the paragraphs within the section tag or within the parent tag, regardless of what level they're at. So if they're nested, double nested inside of something else, or if they're not, it will still select all the paragraphs. So that's a descendant selector. Versus a direct child selector. So a direct child selector will only select the direct children of the parent element and not all matching elements nested inside. So to do that, you just use the greater than symbol in between the section and the P selector. So you're saying within the section, I only want to select the paragraphs that are direct children of section, not direct children of a div within a section. So, for example, if you wrote that, then this paragraph would be selected because it's a direct child of section, but this one wouldn't because it's a grandchild of section because it's within another nested element. And then it would select this paragraph because it's on the same level as this other paragraph element. Hope that makes sense. And then attribute selectors are even more specific if you want to select something using an attribute selector. So our first attribute selector identifies an element based on whether it has the specified attribute or not. To do this, we simply include the attribute name in the square brackets within a selector. So in all of the links, so A is a link tag, so in all of the links, we only want the links that have this attribute target assigned to them. And we're going to style those a certain way. The attribute equals selector, it identifies an element with a specific exact matching attribute value. So you include the attribute name in square brackets and the quotation marks and the equal sign and the actual name of that attribute. So if you have a specific attribute within the input values that you want to style, you can do that. The attribute contains selector, you use the asterisk character in there to say, I only want to select links that contain the word home somewhere in the link. So that should fall just right after the attribute name and directly before the equal sign. And then you have a attribute begins or ends with selector. And these can select an element based on whether an attribute value starts with or ends with the specified value. So like, for example, if it starts with HTTPS, you can have it only select those links. Or if the image ends in a .png, you can have it select only those images. The attribute selectors I don't use as often as I use pseudo classes. So a pseudo class is similar to a regular class in HTML, except they are triggered as a result of the user's actions or the document structure. So a pseudo class is going to begin with a colon, and the most common pseudo class that you'll use is hover. So when somebody is hovering over a link with a mouse, it's going to change color. That's a pseudo class. So there's 3 actions that are typically used with pseudo classes. So remember, A is our link tags. So A hover is when somebody's hovering over the link, we want it to do this. A active is when somebody's clicking the link, and A focus is the link that you want them to focus on or have look different than the other links. And then there's 2 other pseudo classes. There's a link, which defines a style to any links that have not been visited. And then a visited will style any links that have already been visited. So if somebody goes back to your page and you want it to look like they've visited the link, that's typically done with a purple color. Like in Google, it's purple if you've already visited it. So you can actually change the color to whatever you want there. So user interface state pseudo classes, these are elements that are affected by the user, but do not require continuous input to perform the action. So some include enabled, disabled, checked, and interdeterminate. So if you want, for example, if you want a specific box to already be checked on a form, then you can label it as enabled. The last 2 interface element state pseudo classes mentioned above revolve around radio or checkbox inputs, like I said. So checked will style any checkbox specifically when a user checks a checkbox input, and indeterminate applies immediately before any action is taken while the radio or checkbox hasn't been clicked or selected. 3 more pseudo classes that you may see, may not, are the pseudo classes first child, last child, and only child. So if you use the pseudo class first child, it'll only select the first item of that kind. And if you use the pseudo class last child, it'll only select the last item of that kind. And then if you select the only child, then it will only select that paragraph. Okay, so hopefully this helps you put your mind around how to select more specific items from your HTML document to give them styles in your CSS document.